Hello, friends. Welcome back to Kettle Park Chapter a Day. Today we have some special guests since we're reading about Buck the dog. This is Mindy and Mandy, my two foster puppies that will be joining us today, and they're very wild. Arr. So they want to say hi. Oops. Today we will be reading Chapter 4 of The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Again, written in 1903. Today's chapter is Chapter 4, Who Has Won to Mastership? Kettle, park yourself somewhere comfortable and enjoy the chapter. What I say? I speak true when dat say buck two devils. This was Francis's speech next morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered with wounds. He drew him to the fire and by its light pointed them out. "Dat spats fight to hell," said Perlot, and he surveyed the gaping rips and cuts. "And dat buck fight like two hells," said Francis answered. "And now we make 'em good time. No more spits, no more trouble, sure." While Perlot packed the camp outfit and loaded the sled, the dog driver proceeded to harness the dogs. Buck trotted up to the place Spitz would have occupied as leader, but Francis, not notching him, brought Solix to the coveted position. In his judgment, Solix was the best lead dog left. Buck sprang upon Solix in fury, driving him back and standing in his place. Francis cried, slapping his thighs gleefully. "Look at that Buck. Him kill dat Spitz and he think he take the job. Go away, Chook," he cried, but Buck refused to budge. He took Buck by the scruff of the neck, and though the dog growled threateningly, dragged him to one side and replaced Solix. The old dog did not like it, and showed plainly that he was afraid of Buck. Francis was obdurate, but when he turned his back, Buck again displaced Solix, who was not at all unwilling to go. Francis was angry. "Now dat gar you feeks you," he cried, coming back with the heavy club in hand. Buck remembered the man with the red sweater and retreated slowly, nor did he attempt to charge when Solix was once more brought forward, but he circled just beyond the range of the club, snarling with bitterness and rage, and while he circled, he watched the club so as to dodge it, if thrown by Francis, for he would become wise in the ways of clubs. The driver went about his work, and he called to Buck. When he was ready to put him in the old place in front of Dave, Buck retreated 2 or 3 steps. Francis followed him up, whereupon he again retreated. After some time of this, Francis threw down the club, thinking that Buck feared a thrashing. But Buck was in open revolt. He wanted not to escape a clubbing, but to have the leadership. It was his by right. He had earned it, and he would not be content with less. Perlot took a hand between them, and they ran him about for the better part of an hour. They threw clubs at him. He dodged. They cursed him, and his fathers and mothers before him, and all his seed to come after him, down to the remotest generation, and every hair on his body and drop of blood in his veins. And he answered curse with a snarl, and kept out of their reach. He did not try to run away, but retreated around and around the camp, advertising plainly that when his desire was met, he would come in and be good. Francis sat down and scratched his head. Perlot looked at his watch and swore. Time was flying, and they should have been on the trail an hour ago. Francis scratched his head again. He shook it and grinned sheepishly at the courier, who shrugged his shoulders as a sign that they were beaten. Then Francis went up to Solix, stood and called to Buck. Buck laughed as dogs laughed, yet kept his distance. Francis unfastened Solix's traces and put him back in his old place. The team stood harnessed to the sled in an unbroken line, ready for the trail. There was no place for Buck save at the front. Once more Francis called, and once more Buck laughed and kept away. "Throw down that club," Perlot commanded. Francis complied, whereupon Buck trotted in, laughing triumphantly, and swung around into position at the head of the team. His traces were fastened and the sled broken out, and with the 2 men running, they dashed out onto the river trail. Highly as the dog driver had forevalued Buck with his 2 devils, he found, while the day was yet young, that he was undervalued, and at a bound Buck took up the duties of leadership, and where judgment was required, and quick thinking and quick acting, he showed himself the superior, even to Spitz, of whom Francis had never met an equal. But it was in giving the law and making his mate mates live up to it that Buck excelled. Dave and Solix did not mind the change in leadership. It was none of their business. The business was toil, and the toil mightily in the traces, so long as they were not interfered with. They did not care what happened. Billy, the good-natured, could lead for all they cared, and as long as he kept order, the rest of the team, however, had grown unruly during the last days of Spitz, and their surprise was great now that Buck proceeded to lick them into shape. Pike, who pulled at Buck's heels, and who never put an ounce more of his weight against the breastplate than he was compelled to do, was swiftly and repeatedly shaken for loafing, and ere the first day was done, he was pulling more than ever before in his life. The first night in camp, Joe, the sour one, was punished roundly, a thing that Spitz had never succeeded in doing. Buck simply smothered him by virtue of superior weight, and cut him up until he ceased snapping and began to whine for mercy. The general tone of the team picked up immediately. It recovered its old-time solitary, and once more the dogs leaped as one dog in the traces. At the rink rapids, 2 native huskies, Teak and Kona, were added, and the celerity with which Buck broke them in took away Francis's breath. "Ne'er such a dog as that Buck," he cried. "No, never. He'm worth $1,000, eh, Gar? Eh? You say that, Perlot?" And Perlot nodded. He was headed of the record then, and gaining day by day. The trail was in excellent condition, well packed and hard, and there were no new fallen snow with which to contend. It was not too cold. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero and remained there the whole trip. The men rode and ran by turn, and the dogs were kept on the jump, but without infrequent stoppages. The 30-mile river was comparatively coated with ice, and they covered it in one day, going out with what had taken them 10 days in coming. In one day they made 60-mile dash for the foot of Lake LeBaire and the White Horse Rapids, across Marsh, Tagish, and Bennett, 70 miles of lakes. They flew so fast that the man whose turn it was to run towed behind the sled at the end of the rope. And on the last night of the second week they topped White Pass and dropped down to the sea slope, with the lights of Skagway and the shipping at their feet. It was a record run. Each day for 14 days they had averaged 40 miles. 4 3-day Perlot and Francis threw chests up and down the main street of Skagway, and they were deluged with invitations to drink, while the team was in constant center of worshipful crowd of dog busters and mushers. Then 3 of the 4 western bad men aspired to clean out the town, were riddled like pepper boxes for their pains. The public interest turned to other idiots. Next came official orders. Francis called Buck to him, threw his arms around him, and wept over him. And that was the last of France and Perlot. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life for good. A Scotch half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back over the weary trail to Dawson. It was no light running now, nor a record time, but heavy toil each day, with a heavy load behind them, for this was a mail train, carrying word from the world of men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. Buck did not like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it after the manner of Dave and Solex, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided in it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life, operating with machine-like regulatory. One day was very much like the other. At a certain time each morning the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were under way an hour or so before the darkness fell, which gave warning of the dawn. At night camp was made. Some pitched the flies, others cut firewood and pine boughs for the beds, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. Also, the dogs were fed. To them this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around after the fish was eaten, for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there were 50 the odd. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of his way. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire, hind legs crouched under him, 4 legs stretched out in front, head raised and eyes blinking, dreamily of the fires. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of the Content swimming tank, and Yazabel, the Mexican hairless, and Toots, the Japanese pug. But oftener he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight of Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The Sunland was very dim and distant, and the memories had no power over him. Far more potent were the memories of his hereditary, that gave things he had never seen before seemingly familiarity. The instincts, which were but the memories of his ancestors, became habits, which had lapsed in later days, and still later in him quickened and become alive again. Sometimes, as he crouched there, blinking dreamily at the flames, it seemed that the flames were of another fire, and that he was crouched by this other fire. He saw another indifferent man from a half-breed cook before him. This other man was a shorter of leg and longer of arms, with muscles that were stringy and knotty rather than rounded and swelling. The hair of this man was long and matted, and his head slanted back under it from the eyes. He uttered strange sounds and seemed very much afraid of the darkness, into which he peered continually, clutching in his hand, which hung midway between knee and foot, a stick with a heavy stone made fast to the end. He was all but naked, a ragged and fire-scorched skin hanging part way down his back, but on his body there was much hair, in some places across his chest and shoulders, and down the outside of his arms and thighs. It was matted into almost a thick fur. He did not stand erect, but the trunk inclined toward from the hips on the legs and bent at the knees. About his body there was a peculiar springiness and resiliency, almost cat-like, and a quick alertness as one who lived in perpetual fear of things seen and unseen. At other times this hairy man squatted by the fire, with head between his legs, and slept. On such occasions his elbows were on his knees, his hands clasped above his head, as though to shed rain by his hairy arms, and beyond that fire, in the circling darkness, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of the great beasts of prey, and he could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth, and the noises they made in the night. And dreaming there by the Yukon bank, the lazy eyes blinking at the fire, these sounds and sights of another world would make the hair to rise along the back and stand on end across his shoulders and up his neck, till he whimpered low and suppressedly, or growled softly, and the half-breed cook shouted at him, "Hey, you Buck, wake up!" Whereupon the other world would vanish, and the real world could come into his eyes, and he would get up, yawn, stretch, as though he had been asleep. It was a hard trip with the mail behind them, and the heavy works wore them down. They were short of weight and in good condition when they made Dawson, and should have been a 10-day or a week rest at least. But in 2 days' time they dropped down the Yukon bank from the barracks loaded with letters for the outside. The dogs were tired and the drivers grumbling, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail, greater friction on the runners, and heavier pulling for the dogs, yet the drivers were fair through it all, and did their best for the animals. Each night the dogs were attended to first. They ate before the drivers ate, and no man sought to his sleeping robe till he had seen and fed to the dogs. Still their strength went down. Since the beginning of winter they had traveled 1,800 miles, dragging sleds the whole weary distance, and 1,800 miles will tell upon life of the toughest. Buck stood it, keeping his mates up to their work and maintaining discipline, though he too was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered regularly to his sleep each night. Joe was sourer than ever, and Solex was unapproachable, blind side or other side. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong for him. He became more morose and irritable, and when camp was pitched, at once made his nest where his driver fed him. Once out of the harness and down, he did not get on his feet again till harnessed up time in the morning. Sometimes in the traces, when jerked by a sudden stoppage of the sled, or by straining to start it, he would cry out with pain. The driver examined him, but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his care. They talked it over at mealtime, and over their last pipes before going to bed, and one night they held a consultation. He was brought from his nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded till he cried out many times. Something was wrong inside, but they could locate no broken bones, could not make it out. By the time Kasser Bar was reached, he was so weak that he was falling repeatedly in the traces. The Scotch half-breed called to a halt and took him out of the team, making the next dog, Solix, fast to the sled. His intention was to rest Dave, letting him run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave resented being taken out, grunting and growling while the traces were unfastened, and whimpering broken-heartedly when he saw Solix in position he had held and served so long. For the pride of the trace, the trail was his, and sick unto death, he could not bear that another dog should do his work. When the sled started, he floundered on the soft snow alongside the beaten trail, attacking Solix with his teeth, rushing against him and trying to thrust him off into the soft snow on the other side, striving to leap inside his traces and get between him and the sled, and all the while whining and yelping and crying with grief and pain. The half-breed tried to drive him away with a whip, but he paid no heed to the stinging lash, and the man had not the heart to strike harder. Dave refused to run quietly on the trail behind the sled where the going was easy, but continued to flounder alongside in the soft snow, where the going was most difficult, till exhausted. Then he fell, and lay where he fell, howling lugubriously as the long train of sleds turned by. With the last remnant of his strength, he managed to stagger along behind the till of the train, made another stop, when he floundered past the sleds to his own, where he stood alongside Solix. His driver lingered a moment to get a light for his pipe from the man behind. Then he returned and started his dogs. They swung out on the trail with remarkable lack of exertion, turning their heads uneasily, and stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised too. The sled had not moved. He called his commands to witness the sight. Dave had bitten through both Solix's traces and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. He pleaded with the eyes to remain there. The driver was perplexed. His comrades talked of how a dog could break the hearts through being denied the work that killed it, and recalled the instances that he had known where dogs, too old for the toil or injured, had died because they were cut off from the chases. Also, they held it a mercy, since Dave was to die anyway, that he should die in the chases, heart easy and content. So he was harnessed in again, and proudly he pulled as one old. Through more than once he cried out involuntarily from the bite of his inward hurt. Several times he fell down and was dragged in the traces, and once the sled ran upon him so that he limped thereafter in one of his hind legs. But he held out until camp was reached, when the driver made a place for him by the fire. Morning found him too weak to travel. At harness-up time he tried to crawl to his driver, but convulsive efforts he got to his feet, staggered and fell. Then he wormed his way forward slowly toward where the harnesses were being put on his mates. He would advance his forelegs and drag his body with short hitching movements. When he would advance his forelegs and hitch ahead again for a few more inches, his strength left him, and the last his mates saw of him, he lay gasping in the snow, yearning toward them. But they could hear him mournfully howling till they passed out of sight behind a belt of river timber. Here the train was halted. The Scotch half-breed slowly retraced his steps to the camp they had left. The men ceased talking. A revolver shot rang out. The man came back hurriedly. The whip snapped, the bells tinkled merrily, and the sleds churned along the trail. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of the river trees. That is the end of chapter 4. Tune in tomorrow, and we'll read chapter 5. Bye-bye.